It started, as many of Joe Rogan's conversations do, with a story that came out of nowhere. He was sitting across from a guest who had been talking about history, not the kind you find in school textbooks, but the kind of history that breathes, bleeds, and still shakes people's hearts over 1,000 years later. And then the name came up, Bilal. Joe leaned in. He had never heard it before, not in this way, not with the weight, the emotion, the sense that this wasn't just about one man, but about an idea so powerful it refused to die, no matter how much pain it had to endure. Who was this guy? Joe asked. The guests smiled, almost as if they knew Joe was about to fall down a rabbit hole that he would never climb out of. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a general, he wasn't rich, he was a slave, but he became a legend. For the next few minutes, Joe didn't say a word. He listened, and the story unfolded like something from a film. Except this wasn't fiction. It happened in the harsh deserts of Arabia, 1400 years ago. Bilal ibn Rabah, a man born into chains, forced to serve masters who saw him not as a human being, but as property. The Mecca he lived in was a world divided by tribe and status. If you were born free, you had rights. If you were born enslaved, you were invisible. And Bilal, he had nothing. No land, no power, no voice. Until he heard about a man named Muhammad, a man who was teaching something that, to the rulers of Mecca, was dangerous, the belief that there is only one God, no idols, no statues, no illusions, just the creator of the heavens and the earth. And in this belief, everyone, slave or king, was equal. For Joe, this was the hook, equal. In the 7th century, he shook his head. That must have sounded insane back then. The guest explained that for someone like Bilal, these words weren't just a religious claim. They were freedom. They meant his worth wasn't defined by who owned him or how much gold he had. It was defined by the one who made him. It meant he was already free, in a way his masters could never touch. But freedom, in that time and place, came with a price. And for Bilal, that price was almost his life. Joe's brow furrowed. So they tried to break him? The answer was yes, in the most brutal way possible. The scene was almost unbearable to imagine. A scorching midday sun, the kind that made the sand feel like burning metal. Bilal was dragged into the open, thrown to the ground, and a massive stone was placed on his chest so he couldn't breathe without pain. His master stood over him, demanding that he give up this new faith, to renounce the name of the one God, to return to the old ways. And here's the part that Joe couldn't stop thinking about, the part that kept replaying in his head for days after he first heard it. Instead of begging for mercy, instead of giving in, Bilal said one word, over and over, through the heat, through the weight crushing his ribs. Ahad. The one. No arguments. No explanations. Just a single word, repeated until it became something more than sound. It became defiance. It became truth. It became the line between who he had been and who he would die being. Joe sat back, almost whispering. That's insane. That's powerful. The guest told him this wasn't just an act of bravery. It was the embodiment of a belief that nothing in this world, not chains, not torture, not even death, could take away the freedom that comes from submitting your heart to God alone. And the people of Mecca, they didn't know what to do with that. A man who owns nothing, yet refuses to give up what matters most. That kind of strength is terrifying. For Joe, the story didn't just end with admiration for a man who stood his ground. It started raising questions. What makes a human being willing to suffer like that for an idea? How do you hold on to faith when your body is breaking? And could any of us endure that kind of test? The more Joe thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just an ancient story. It was about something deeply human, the search for meaning so strong that even the threat of death can't take it away. That night, after the podcast wrapped, Joe went home and found himself replaying the moment in his mind. The sun, the sand, the stone on the chest, and the word, aha. Not screamed in rage, not muttered in fear, but declared with a calm certainty that must have shaken the ground itself. He started reading more, learning who Bilal was, discovering how his life didn't end with that torture, but how it transformed into something even greater. And the more he learned, the more he understood why in the Islamic world, Bilal ibn Rabah is remembered, not for the chains he wore, but for the voice he raised. But that part of the story, the rise from slave to a symbol of faith, would come later. For now, Joe sat with the image of a man under the desert sun, choosing belief over breath. And he wondered, not for the first time, what he himself would choose, if everything he loved was stripped away, and only one truth was left to hold on to. Because sometimes, The stories that haunt us are the ones that quietly ask, what would you do? The desert can be beautiful, but in Mecca it could also be merciless. The sun didn't just shine, it scorched. And for Bilal ibn Rabah, that heat wasn't just a part of life. It was a weapon. In that world, slavery was normal. A man could be bought, sold, and beaten without anyone calling it injustice. And Bilal, born to an Abyssinian slave mother, was bound in those chains from the moment he took his first breath. His master, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, was one of the most powerful men in Mecca, and one of the most ruthless. When Bilal embraced Islam, it was more than just a personal decision, it was rebellion, because to believe in one God meant you rejected the idols, the social hierarchy, and the economic power those idols represented. To men like Umayyah, this wasn't just religious defiance, it was a threat to their control. Joe Rogan, hearing this part of the story for the first time, leaned forward. Wait, so just saying you believe in one God could get you tortured? The guest nodded. Not just tortured, Joe. They wanted to break you in body, in mind, and in soul, to make an example out of you so no one else would dare to follow this new message. And that's exactly what they tried to do to Bilal. They dragged him into the heart of the desert, far from the shade of the city walls. They threw him onto the burning ground, sand so hot it seared the skin. His arms and legs were bound. And then, the stone, a massive slab, heavy enough to crush the breath from his chest, was placed on him so he couldn't move. Joe shook his head. That's not just pain, that's slow death. The guest's voice lowered. They wanted him to choose between life and faith, between breath and belief. But Bilal didn't scream for release. He didn't beg for water. Instead, he closed his eyes and spoke. One word, over and over. Ahad, 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 the one. The one. Every time he said it, it was like a strike against his master's authority. Because if Bilal's heart belonged to God alone, no master could truly own him. And that kind of freedom, invisible, untouchable, terrified men who relied on power and fear to control others. Joe interrupted. Man, I've done hard things, I've pushed my body to limits. But this is something else. You're talking about torture under the sun, a rock crushing your ribs, and you're just praying? The guest smiled faintly. It wasn't just prayer, Joe, it was resistance. It was telling them, you can take my body but you can't touch my soul. The tortures continued for days. At times they would drag Bilal through the streets, whipping him, mocking him in front of the crowds. They thought public humiliation would work where pain had failed. But every time they gave him a chance to recant, his answer never changed. And here's the thing Joe found fascinating. Bilal's defiance didn't make him angrier or louder. It made him calmer. As if the more they tried to strip him of dignity, the more his faith wrapped around him like armor. For the people of Mecca, this was confusing. For the rulers it was infuriating. And for the small but growing Muslim community, it was inspiring. If a man with no status, no wealth, no tribe to protect him could stand his ground, what excuse did they have to give in to fear? Joe tapped his fingers on the table, deep in thought. So, they couldn't break him, but why didn't they just kill him? The guest explained that killing him might make him a martyr, and martyrs have a way of turning into legends that inspire more followers. Instead, they wanted him alive, but broken. They wanted the living image of submission, not the symbol of resistance. But Bilal was not the kind of man to give them what they wanted. The days stretched on, his body weakened, the sun baked his skin until it blistered, and yet his voice, hoarse, cracked, but unshaken, kept rising into the air with that single word, Ahad. In the stillness of the night, when the city slept and the air cooled, Bilal would be left in the sand too weak to stand, and sometimes, a shadow would appear beside him. It was Abu Bakr, one of the closest companions of the Prophet Muhammad. He would speak softly, telling Bilal to hold on, that freedom was coming, that God's promise was true, and even though his chains were still tight, even though the stones still crushed him by day, Bilal believed, because faith once rooted deep enough, doesn't wait for the chains to be gone before it feels free. Joe rubbed his chin, his voice almost a whisper. That's the part I can't shake. He wasn't just surviving, he was choosing this suffering over betraying what he believed in. That's on a different level. The guest nodded. That's why his story survived, Joe. It's not just history, it's a mirror. It forces you to ask yourself, what would you endure for what's true? In Mecca, the people who passed by and heard Bilal's voice knew they were witnessing something rare. A man with nothing to lose and nothing to gain in this world.
yet willing to give everything for the next. The rulers thought chains could control him, but the truth was, the chains were only on his body. His soul had already slipped free, and that made him untouchable. And in the desert, under that blazing sun, something was happening that his oppressors didn't realize. With every breathless ahad, Bilal wasn't just defying them. He was planting a seed in the hearts of those who heard him, a seed that would one day grow into a call heard across the world. But that was still to come. It was just a single word, 2 syllables. But in that time and place, it carried the weight of an earthquake. Ahad, the one. When Bilal's cracked lips formed that word under the burning sun, it wasn't simply an act of faith, it was an open challenge to an entire way of life that had stood for centuries. In Mecca, the Kaaba was surrounded by hundreds of idols, carved stone and wood figures, representing the gods of every tribe. Each one had its rituals, its offerings, its guardians. Religion wasn't just about belief, it was an economy, it was politics, it was power. And then came this enslaved man, lying in the dust, his body pinned by a stone, whispering that all of it was meaningless. That there was no God except one, no idols, no tribal deities, no special privileges for the rich or the powerful, just the Creator, unseen, without image, without equal. Joe Rogan, listening to this part of the story, leaned back and exhaled slowly. You're telling me, in a society built on hundreds of gods, here's this guy at the bottom of the ladder, saying they're all fake, except one. The guest nodded, and he wasn't just saying it, Joe. He was saying it under torture, in public, loud enough for people to hear. Imagine how dangerous that was. Because in those days, words were not harmless. A single word could spark a blood feud between tribes. A single word could ruin the reputation of a family. And ahad, from the mouth of a slave, was like striking a match in a room filled with oil. The Quraysh, Mecca's ruling tribe, were furious. Every time Bilal refused to renounce that word, it made them look weak, it made their idols look powerless, and it made people start to wonder, if a man like Bilal can endure all this, for one God, maybe there's something to what Muhammad is saying. Joe tilted his head. So it wasn't just about Bilal holding his faith, it was about the ripple effect. Exactly, the guest replied. That one word was planting doubt in people's minds about the entire system, and doubt is dangerous to those who rely on control. But here's what fascinated Joe. Bilal wasn't shouting in anger, he wasn't making speeches or debating theology, he was just repeating that one word, again and again, like a drumbeat in the desert. Ahad, ahad, ahad. And that in its own way was even more powerful. Because when a man is beaten, starved and suffocating under a stone, yet still calmly says the same thing, people notice. They start to wonder what kind of strength allows that. The guest explained the depth of the word ahad. In Arabic it doesn't just mean one as in a number, it means the one and only, completely unique, unlike anything else, indivisible. It's not just a statement about God's existence, it's a statement that nothing else deserves your worship, your fear, or your ultimate loyalty. Joe's eyes narrowed. So when he said ahad, he was basically saying, you don't own me, nobody owns me, only God does. Exactly, the guest said. And that's why it scared them so much. Because if more people started believing that, the entire social order would collapse. You couldn't control people who feared only God. You couldn't buy the loyalty of someone whose heart was already taken. The more the Quraysh tortured him, the more the word spread. Children whispered it in the alleyways. Travelers carried it to distant markets. Merchants overheard it, and took it home to their families. It became more than a prisoner's defiance. It became a message. And messages are harder to chain than men. Joe rubbed his hands together, almost restless. Man, it's like, you can kill a man but you can't kill an idea, and that word, that's the idea. Exactly. The Quraysh could beat Bilal but they couldn't make him say the names of their idols again. They could drag him through the streets, but they couldn't drag the belief out of his heart. And for the small group of Muslims in Mecca at the time, Bilal's voice was a rallying cry. They saw in him a living example of what it meant to trust God completely, even when the price was everything. It gave them courage, it gave them hope, and perhaps most importantly, it gave them proof. Proof that this message wasn't just for the wealthy, or the noble-born. It was for everyone from the slave in the dust, to the chief in his palace. Joe sat forward. So this is why his story survived all these centuries. It's not just about the man, it's about the word. That one word that wouldn't die. The guest nodded. And what's amazing is, The same word is still part of the Muslim call to prayer today. Every time it's recited, it's like an echo from that day in the desert. And here's the part that gave Joe chills. Bilal had no way of knowing that when he spoke Ahad, under that stone, his voice was starting a chain reaction that would travel across continents and centuries. A voice that one day would call millions to remember the same truth he refused to let go of. But that part of his journey, the moment when his voice would rise not in pain but in triumph, was still in the future. For now the desert still held him, the chains still cut into his wrist, and the stone still pressed down on his chest. But in the hearts of those who heard him, the ground was beginning to shake. The chains that bound Bilal were real, heavy iron wrapped tight around his wrists and ankles. But what weighed even more was the struggle between two kinds of freedom. On one side was the freedom his master held, the freedom to own, to command, to control. On the other side was the freedom Bilal carried inside, the freedom of the heart and soul that no chains could break. Joe Rogan, hearing this, leaned in, voice quiet but intense. So he was physically a slave but spiritually free. The guest nodded slowly. Yes, and that's what makes his story unforgettable. One of the most powerful moments in Bilal's life came when Abu Bakr, the close companion of Prophet Muhammad, died. Abu Bakr saw something no one else did. A man who was enslaved by society but freed by faith. He bought Bilal's freedom with his own money, breaking those iron chains. But the story doesn't stop there. Joe was surprised to learn that even after his literal chains were removed, Bilal's true freedom wasn't something anyone could give or take away. It was already his. Joe's voice softened. Wait, so Abu Bakr freed him, but Bilal was never really a slave to begin with. Exactly, the guest said. His body was enslaved but his spirit was never chained. His faith made him a free man long before the chains were broken. That's a concept that resonates deeply when you think about it. How often do people believe freedom is about physical conditions, money, status, possessions? But Bilal's story flips that on its head. He was free because he belonged to something bigger than himself. A connection so strong that no master's whip, no stone on his chest, no burning sun could destroy it. Joe reflected on this. Man, that's heavy. Freedom isn't about the cage, it's about the mind. And in that freedom, Bilal found a new role. The Prophet himself chose Bilal for a sacred task, calling the believers to prayer. The voice that had once cried out in pain under the desert sun would become the voice that united a growing community. Joe's voice rose slightly, filled with awe. So the guy who was tortured for his faith ends up being the one whose voice calls millions to worship. Yes, the guest said. That's the power of true freedom. It transforms suffering into strength, chains into wings. But the choice to take that role was not simple. Bilal had every reason to remain quiet, to stay hidden. His past was brutal, his wounds deep. Yet when he stood atop the roof and called the Adhan, the call to prayer, his voice carried more than just words. It carried hope. It carried resilience. It carried the unshakable belief that freedom starts inside. Joe sat back almost speechless. It's like he took his pain and made it a weapon against oppression. The guest smiled. Exactly. And that's why his story still moves people today, because it's about more than history. It's about what freedom truly means in any time, any place. Joe thought aloud. It makes me wonder, how many of us are trapped in invisible chains? Chains of fear, doubt, anger. The guest nodded. Bilal's story is a reminder that those chains can be broken, not with money, not with power, but with faith and courage. As the sun set over Mecca, Bilal's chains lay broken on the ground. But his real freedom, the kind that can never be taken, was just beginning to After all the pain, all the chains, all the nights spent under the burning sun, Bilal ibn Rabah stood taller than ever, not just as a man freed from slavery, but as a voice that would echo through history. Joe Rogan, reflecting on this, might say, man, think about that. This guy went from being tortured in the desert to becoming the sound that calls millions to prayer every day. That's legendary. And it truly is legend. Bilal's voice became the first adhan, the Islamic call to prayer, a sacred summons heard across cities and villages, calling people from all walks of life to pause, reflect and turn their hearts toward God. Imagine that moment, a voice rising over the city, once a prisoner's cry, now a melody of hope and unity. The same voice that refused to surrender under torture, now inspired an entire community to stand strong together. The significance goes far beyond the sound itself. Joe would likely ask, why does this call still matter today? What's so powerful about a voice in the desert that makes it still resonate with millions? The answer lies in what the adhan represents. A breaking of chains, both visible and invisible. Every time the muezzin calls out Allah Akbar, God is the greatest, it's a reminder that no matter how deep the struggles, how heavy the burdens, there is a power greater than oppression, greater than fear, greater than pain. Bilal's journey wasn't just about one man's endurance. It was a symbol that even the most oppressed can rise and lead. It reminds us that faith is a force that can transform suffering into strength, silence into song. For Joe, this story might spark a deeper reflection. If this man, born a slave and broken by torture, could become the voice that calls millions to faith, what does that say about us? About what we can endure? About the power we hold inside? It challenges the idea of what freedom really means. Because true freedom isn't about escaping hardship or owning things. It's about owning your soul, your beliefs, your purpose. Bilal's voice calls out every day, reminding the world that chains can bind the body, but never the spirit. And through his story, Joe Rogan, and all of us are invited to ask ourselves, what chains do we carry, and how can we find the courage to break them? The story of Bilal ibn Rabah is more than history. It's a timeless message of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable power of faith. As the adhan echoes across the world today, from minarets in bustling cities to quiet villages, it carries the heartbeat of a man who once lay under a burning sun, whispering a single word that changed everything. Ahad, the one.